Okay, so shortly I'll hand over to Jake from Devon Wildlife Trust, but first, just to set the scene, I'm going to say a little bit more about the background to this event for a couple of minutes. So this event's been organised by Connecting the Culm. It's a partnership project with funding from the Environment Agency, Mid Devon District Council, Devon County Council, the Blackdown Hills AONB, and the National Trust, and also European funding as part of the Interreg Co-Adapt project. Someone is somehow annotating my slides. I don't know how that's happening, but please refrain from doing that. And yeah, the focus of this project is all about this 100 square miles that you can see on the screen, just north of Exeter, of the mid-Devon countryside. So there's 100 square miles that of this landscape drains into the River Culm. And the project is all about tackling the current and future pressures which threaten the health of the river, its tributaries and the wider catchment, including improving resilience to climate change. And we're aiming to do this by working better with nature and people, including involving more and more diverse stakeholders along the way than is the norm. And over the next couple of years, the project is going to be engaging and learning from and involving lots of people, communities and local stakeholders in the process. We'll be installing some nature-based interventions with landowners, which is going to be starting very soon, and that's to test and demonstrate what nature-based solutions work in the catchment. And we'll also be collaborating to develop the blueprint for the Culm, and that's a vision for the future of what a resilient river and catchment will look like in the latter half of this century, and importantly then working together on how we make that vision a reality. And the blueprint is a really important part of the project and really exciting. And it's going to be shaped by local stakeholders, and it will also link to public bodies and infrastructure agencies and their policies and plans and investment decisions in the future. So I'm going to share a little bit more about the process that we're currently going through this year to develop the blueprint, because today is actually an important part of that. So what you can see on the screen is some of the events that we've got going on at the moment that are part of this process. So firstly, the first two columns are the working groups. So these are smaller focus sessions with smaller groups. And these are focusing on particular themes that have been identified as key issues or opportunities that people want to explore. So particularly water quality, nature-based solutions and access. And also we have groups that are geographically based in the catchment, so connecting local communities to work together on action in their area. And then on the right-hand side is the catchment adaptation workshops. And these are big one-off public events like this, where we bring an expert on a relevant topic to inform and lead a discussion. And then we hope to capture that input and feed it into the blueprint through the working groups. So today is all about beavers. We'll be hearing from Jake. And in the future, we'll be hopefully trying to embed that in what we think it means for the future of the catchment. And I'll just quickly mention a few other things coming up. One, the first is starting next week, and then on dates throughout March on Tuesdays and Thursdays is the blueprint working groups. So if you're interested in these sorts of issues and the solutions to overcome them, and you want to get more involved than you are today, then please do get involved and come along to those events. There's the dates for each of the groups are on the website. And then also in March, March the 17th, you can sign up on Eventbrite like you did for today. There is a session focused on the Culm citizen science investigations. So that's all about local people playing an important role in monitoring water quality and the health of the river. And you can hear from the current volunteers and also find out about how you can get involved in monitoring water body near you. And finally, really exciting, the next one of these events, the catchment adaptation workshops, is going to be all about climate resilience, and that's going to be in mid-April. We've got some really exciting speakers coming to that, and we're just finalising the date, so it's probably going to be the week after Easter, the middle of April. So keep an eye out for that, and yeah, please sign up to the newsletter or check the website events page for any other things that come up in the future. So back to today. Before I hand over to Jake, I just wanted to sort of say, what is this all about? And I think the really key thing here is the image on the top left shows the dark grey area is the catchment of the River Culm, and the bit immediately to the south and east of it is the catchment of the River Otter. So the River Culm, we know, has its own characteristics and challenges, some of which you can see on the screen. And it's a neighbour to the River Otter and England's wild beaver population. Beavers have legs and are capable of walking over the hill. One of them already has at some point, and others may do in the future. So we really want to find out what that may mean, what's happened in the River Otter in the beaver trial there, and yeah, get thinking about what that means for the future. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Jake and look forward to hearing from him and from everyone else in the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, let's get this share screen up. Okie dokie. Right, hello everyone, and thanks Stephen for the introduction. I trust everybody can hear me okay. So, yes, I've been working for Devon Wildlife Trust over the past 4 years on the River Otter Beaver Trial. My job title is the Beaver Field Officer. That means that I work with landowners day to day to educate them on what beavers do, how we can live with beavers, how we can manage beaver impacts. And I also spend quite a bit of the time monitoring beaver activity. And I work very closely with Exeter University when I'm doing that work. In today's talk, I'm going to introduce you to beavers. I scrolled through some of the faces on the videos at the start of this talk, so I'm aware that some of you already know quite a bit about beavers. But we'll start with the basics, introducing beavers and a bit of their behaviour. Throughout the talk, I'm going to put in some slides of press articles that have appeared in the last few weeks that are perhaps important to take account of when we're thinking about watercourses and aquatic environments and sort of beavers' impact on that. It's interesting, Stephen, on your talk that you mentioned nature-based solutions. Perhaps beavers should be seen as one of those solutions, as a natural solution to some problems that we currently have in catchments across England and the United Kingdom. So I'll start with a clip, and you should be able to hear the sound of this as well. This is an adult beaver. It's a female beaver, and she's feeding at the top of the River Otter catchment in the height of summer. She's out early in the evening because she's hungry. She's lactating, and after she's stuffed her face full of the aquatic vegetation, she will be going back to her lodge and feeding her kits with milk. Beavers have 1 litre of kits a year, and this particular beaver tends to have 2 or 3 beaver kits. So as we've seen there, beavers are herbivores. They were hunted to extinction in England approximately 400 years ago. The species, the Eurasian beaver, we have 2 species on the planet, the North American beaver and the Eurasian beaver. The Eurasian beaver has been around for around 2 million years. It's evolved for an aquatic or a semi-aquatic way of life. And you can see here, it's got those large webbed hind feet and that tail and very densely packed fur that means it's very well suited or very well adapted to living in water. One of the reasons it was hunted to extinction is because of that fur. It's a high quality fur and was in great demand for many centuries. This is a particularly nice slide to look at when we're talking about catchments across the United Kingdom. It's very pretty and very colourful. It makes you think what a wonderful place all of those rivers must be. The reality is slightly more depressing, unfortunately. We're going to start this talk with some news articles from this week about the state of our rivers globally, nationally, and we're included in that, unfortunately, in the southwest of England. Global, here we go in The Guardian, global freshwater fish populations at risk of extinction. So we've got serious threats. And this particular article, I think this one was in the Times, that's highlighting the problem with human-made barriers and some of the problems that that causes for migratory fish species. Some of those fish species are, people are interested in fishing them, and some of them, like this, like the eels, people aren't particularly, well, perhaps more of it used to be perhaps fished for food. but very rare now. Alongside this sort of catastrophic state of our watercourses across England, we also have this pressure from perhaps government funding to organisations like the Environment Agency, where pollution events don't go anywhere. Nobody seems to get in trouble for polluting our watercourses. So it's a fairly shocking state of affairs, and one that I have quite a bit of experience in day to day. I walk the catchment, and this year I've seen pollution incidents. I've seen glyphosate and herbicides sprayed right up to and into watercourses. I've seen areas of small streams dredged for gravel, right where I've seen sea trout reds in previous years. So we have issues on the ground that we need to be tackling. And I think today we need to understand that beavers are a small part of the river system, and there are many influences on these catchments. And when we talk today, I'll later talk about water quality and the impacts that beavers have on water quality. Beavers aren't the answer to all of our problems. They can provide, they can create perhaps more flood resilient landscapes, but we have to work on many different things to make sure our catchments and our river habitats are in better condition in the future. So this particular map, I've zoomed into the southwest of England, and in the very centre of the map, we've got the River Otter catchment. It's quite a small catchment, and we can see it here on the right-hand side. It's an area where Devon Wildlife Trust have been working with beavers, particularly throughout the trial period from 2015 to 2020. And after the trial, our work managing the impacts of beavers and working with landowners has continued. The little red dot in the centre of the screen is an enclosed trial. That site's had beavers in since 2011. It's a fenced site, and it's a really useful case study to look at the impacts that beavers have on hydrology. So we'll talk a bit about that later on as well. Now in this particular map, we can see outlines of other river systems, and we'll talk about those in a minute. I guess the big news from last year was that the government announced that beavers could stay in the River Otter catchment and spread naturally. In March 2020, we produced a final report for the beaver trial. And after government had read that, they announced in August that the beavers could stay, which is it's a big conservation success story. It's the first time that an extinct mammal has been reintroduced into England. And it's a sign perhaps that government is willing to think about providing more space for nature, because this animal definitely drives a conversation about providing space for nature, because it can create new wetland habitats. It has evolved to do this over millions of years. So this is the final report. It's quite a long document, but I would recommend having a look at it. It's available as a PDF. Lots of pictures for those of you that like flicking through. It's a coffee table document. And for those of you more interested, a lot of detail. Lead author was Professor Richard Brazier. And also links to YouTube videos of beaver behaviour and the impacts they have on river systems in this report. If you want to access this report, you can find it on Devon Wildlife Trust's webpage. You can also find it on Exeter University's homepage. So today I am going to be talking about the River Otter and the work we've been doing with beavers in that catchment. However, as Stephen's said, one of our closest neighbouring catchments is the River Culm, and we've already had a beaver during the trial period make it into the Culm catchment. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your views on beavers, this beaver was captured and returned to the River Otter. It was the River Otter Beaver Trial. It was not the River Otter and Culm Beaver Trial. The licence from Natural England meant we had to capture any animals outside of the catchment that were ours and bring them back. So as you can see from the next slide, the Culm feeds into the River Exe. And I guess, you know, if we're thinking about the beavers in the River Culm, beavers are capable of dispersing long distances. Sometimes young beavers do disperse throughout entire catchments. Other times young beavers disperse a couple of hundred meters upstream from where they were born. But they are very capable of dispersing throughout river catchments. So if we think about beavers in the River Culm, we should probably be thinking about the wider River Exe catchment. So as far as the River Otter beavers, the beavers appeared on the river in 2007 or 2008. I say appeared, to start with, it was not a deliberate reintroduction. It was perhaps an escape from somewhere where beavers were living within the catchment. We're not too sure. It was not Devon Wildlife Trust releasing them onto the river. It became apparent in 2014 that we had breeding beavers. Government or DEFRA were quite keen on removing them. Devon Wildlife Trust, with the support of local communities, lobbied for a 5-year trial, and with the help of big landowners such as Clinton Devon Estates. And without these big landowners on board, there probably wouldn't have been a beaver trial. So we have to thank big landowners like that getting on board and supporting us for this work. Yeah, trial started in 2015 and finished in 2020. Back at the start of the trial, animal and plant health team came down to look at how many beaver families we had in the catchment at the time, and to make sure that the beavers in the catchment were healthy. So adult beavers in Europe, so in mainland Europe, can carry a tapeworm that we don't currently have in Britain. And there was a risk if adult beavers had come directly from Europe into the River Otter catchment, these could be carrying that particular tapeworm. So they were given their health checks, all sorts of diseases screened for, and that health screening continued throughout the trial. And the health report is part of the final science and evidence report. Anyway, the beavers were disease-free, so they were re-released into the river with their earrings in and with pit tags. Pit tags are a microchip, a bit like your pet dog or cat has in the back of the neck. And that meant that if beavers did escape to the River Culm, we'd be able to check that they were definitely River Otter beavers and hadn't come from elsewhere. So over the period of the trial, we can see that year on year, we have an increase in the population. Some of this increase in population numbers is due to the River Otter Beaver Trial team releasing 5 additional unrelated beavers. Because the beavers in our catchment had a fairly unorganised start to living in the River Otter, it meant that the founding population was a male and a female. When the adult male died, we know that one of his sons replaced him and mated with his own mother, which can lead to inbreeding problems, hence the 5 unrelated animals being released. In the future, the genetic health of beavers is going to be something that people working with beavers are going to have to think about. Saying that, it's apparent on the River Otter that the beavers are breeding successfully and that kit mortality is low. So that means that the young kits are surviving and are healthy, are dispersing and are themselves breeding. And these are all signs of a healthy population. And here we can see an adult beaver with kits. So the adult beaver can weigh up to 30 kilos. That's a particularly large beaver. More typically, the adult beavers weigh between 18 to 25 kilos. Can everybody hear me still?
Yeah, sorry, Jake, we lost you for a moment there, but I can hear you again now.
Okay, so yeah, healthy beaver kits, and they're beginning to disperse throughout the catchment and establish their own territories. This particular footage, I was out surveying this week, and this is a classic kind of sign of young beavers dispersing. This is not a fully grown adult. This is a young beaver, so it's probably around 2 years old. And to be honest, the person I was doing this survey with and myself both thought this beaver was dead when we first saw it because it was so stationary. But this beaver is just, the last couple of nights, it appears to have been living on the side of the bank. It's trying to obviously establish its own territory potentially, or it's just moving through the area. And it's this kind of beaver that's going to potentially disperse into neighbouring catchments. It's these young beavers. They spend a couple of years at their own home lodge growing, and when they're around 2 years old, they reach sexual maturity and their own parents tend to kick them out of their territories, and they have to establish their own territory. So if there's space close by, they might move up or downstream. They might move up a small tributary to their home. And they have done that this year. They've moved into some very small farm ditches that have led to offline ponds, somewhere away from main watercourses that are literally a stone's throw away from neighbouring catchments, including the River Culm. So it's perhaps within a couple of beaver generations, we are going to definitely have beavers moving over the top of the watershed and making home in the Culm catchment, or in the Yardie, perhaps in the River Tone. So yeah, we're going to have to work hard to make sure landowners know how to manage beavers, and we're going to have to provide support for people to get used to living with this species after it's been absent for many hundreds of years. I've put a slide here for the Culm Garden Village. Obviously, this is potentially a very significant development within the Culm catchment, and one that Devon Wildlife Trust has been inputting into over the past 3 to 4 years. Along with folks like Stephen, we're very keen that any development here is conscious of biodiversity and includes ecological networks within the development. Many thousands of homes may be built at this site, so it's important that we consider the natural infrastructure in place at the moment, that we have routes that wildlife can move through, and because we're in a floodplain site here, it's important that any watercourses within this development, we make them resilient, so that if beavers do move into this type of development, we don't create problems for ourselves later on. And there are some fairly simple things we can do to make sure that developments like this are resilient to potential beaver impacts. As I said, we have been working very closely with Exeter University over the 5-year field trial, and we continue to work closely with them here and elsewhere in the county. One of the PhD students, a chap called Hugh Graham, has done some modelling to try and find out how many beaver territories the River Otter catchment could cope with or could support. That's kind of like a carrying capacity. So how many territories can one certain area support? And Hugh's modelling, and it is only a model, suggests that between sort of 150 to 180 family groups could potentially live within the River Otter catchment. Now, I should imagine this winter, I'm just halfway through the winter beaver survey. It's a survey where I walk as much of the river and the tributaries as possible, looking for signs of beavers. And we turn those maps up into the hotspot maps that we saw earlier. Last year, we probably had 13 to 15 beaver territories. This year, I should imagine it would be more like 18 to 20 beaver territories. And Hugh thinks there'll be a lot more than that in the future. It's very likely that 180 beaver families in the River Otter isn't ever going to be reached. It's very likely that we will step in to manage the beaver population before that happens. And that management will include working with landowners to mitigate issues. It will include the education of landowners. It may include trapping and removing beavers from certain areas. If a beaver got into a sewage plant, that would not be an ideal situation. So we would trap and remove those beavers. If you have somewhere to release that beaver, then you can do that as long as the government gives you a license to do that. So this spring, there'll be a consultation. The government will consult on the future of beavers in England. And they'll look at things like whether it should be a protected species, whether they want to reintroduce the beaver more widely, and how we go about doing that when we're potentially releasing them into rivers rather than into enclosed areas. So anyway, if you do have a beaver and you've got somewhere to release it, that's great. If you have a beaver and you have nowhere to release it, then you've got to look at dealing with that situation. And that could mean in the future, culling unwanted beavers. Beaver behaviour in the River Otter catchment and in other catchments across Europe does vary dramatically. I've been over to southern Germany to look at beaver behaviour in places like the Danube. That's a big river over the huge floodplain. And obviously the behaviour of beavers in big rivers, including the Danube, and slightly smaller rivers like the River Otter down near Otterton and Budleigh Saltwater. That beaver behaviour is very different from the beaver behaviour we see in the headwater streams. So down near Otterton, if you're walking along the footpath, you may see signs like this. So this is a small willow tree that's been felled by the beavers. The beavers will chop the small branches off this tree, and they'll feed on the leaves and the bark of the tree. That's a large part of their diet. In the summer months, they do eat soft vegetation as well, but that bark is a significant part of their diet throughout the year. Up in the headwater streams and smaller rivers, we can find beaver dams. And a really important point to make to lots of different users of rivers is that beaver dams can't be built in big rivers. They're not human engineers. They don't use concrete. They don't use reinforced concrete. They use sticks, small twigs, and those sticks and twigs that the beavers put into the stream, and sometimes rocks, bricks, scaffold poles, fencing material, whatever they can find, that kind of traps sediment, and then that sediment and the structure acts as a leaky dam. And in that video, you could see water pouring through the dam. Often beaver dams degrade during high flows, and we'll talk about that a bit later. As well as building beaver dams, the beavers can excavate networks of canals if given space to do so. There's a couple of locations in floodplains that are managed very gently, so not intensive agriculture. The beavers have moved into those areas, and at one particular site, they've excavated hundreds of meters of beaver canals. These are now a network of sort of transport watercourses that the beavers use to move through their own territory. So they use these canals to swim down to find certain food resources. And when they create these types of habitats, they obviously create habitats for other animals. And this is why we call beavers a keystone species. A keystone species is an organism that has a really big impact on its surrounding landscape and the organisms that live within that landscape. So beavers are keystone species, and they have a dramatically positive impact on biodiversity. This particular site, I'm going to sort of put a drone flight on now. This is looking down on top of the beaver canal, and we can see the beaver canal extending along below us, the beaver canal branching out. And this canal is created by the beavers dredging. So they dive underwater, excavate with their front paws, and then lift that soil up onto the side bank. You can see roe deer using this site as well. So it's an exciting place to visit. It's an exciting place to be. And when you go to these beaver created wetlands, you realize what we have been missing for centuries in England. You realize the biodiversity loss that we've suffered. Our headwater areas would have been sopping wet, and beavers would have trapped millions and millions of litres at the tops of our streams. This would have cleaned the water as it came down through the catchments, and it would have acted as a sponge, so that with heavy rainfall events, these kind of habitats absorb water and stop it flowing very quickly off downstream. A couple of months ago, I put actually it wasn't a couple of months, it was last month, I put a camera trap out on this canal. And we've got lots of different organisms, animals using this. Frogs, toads, in the summer months, you see grass snakes using this type of habitat. We're seeing a lot of water voles in this footage, and the water vole population at this site has expanded dramatically as the beavers have created new wetland habitat. So we can see the beavers swimming downstream, and then they're using these beaver canals to float material, mainly woody material, back up to where they need it. So this might be for building a bigger lodge, it might be for building a dam, it might be so they can feed on this material somewhere that they feel safe, which could be inside the beaver lodge. And throughout the night, you can see the beavers coming and going, and the water voles using the same habitat, which is really exciting. And that's perhaps the most exciting thing for me, is that we've even got an otter using these newly created habitats. So otters themselves, 30 years ago, fairly rare, obviously bounced back really well. And for them to be using beaver created habitats is terribly exciting. So along with water voles and other sort of biodiversity, the beavers create habitats. So the biodiversity typically increases, but the sheer biomass at sites increases as well. So some fairly simple frog spawn counts in the West Devon enclosed beaver site showed that over a few years, we went from having 10 clumps of frog spawn up to over 680 clumps of frog spawn. And that's all down to the beavers creating new wetland habitat. We've looked at a beaver dam. Beaver dams on the small ditches and the small streams can stay for a long time. On streams with a little bit more power, most of us would call this a small stream, I guess, but believe it or not, this stream can be very, very powerful. It's one of the tributaries to the River Otter. And we've had beaver dams, numerous beaver dams on this stream. However, at the moment, at the end of winter, there are currently 0 beaver dams in place on this stream. They have all been degraded to some extent because of high flows over winter. That dynamic system, so beavers creating beaver dams and then those dams breaking down over time, creates lots of new habitats, it creates new meanders in the stream, and it creates a really dynamic place that lots of people involved in river restoration get very excited about. This is the kind of thing that happens. We can see the beaver dam here, stretching across the river, and you can see that when a beaver dam degrades because of high flow, it doesn't break down and all wash off downstream. It's far too big to do this. So this dam has just broken down on the far side, and at this particular site, it's actually the bank that gives way rather than the beaver dam. And where you do get this flow over the top of the dam, then you have a plunge pool created beneath this flow area. Over the period of the trial, we've had Southampton University come in to look at the impacts on fish at this particular location. So they've been doing electrofishing. Again, in the main report, there's a lot more information about this, and I suspect there'll be some questions about fisheries at the end of this talk, and please do ask questions. So electrofishing on the River Tail, behind the beaver pool was the greatest abundance of fish. That's probably fairly obvious because it's the greatest abundance of water, so a lot of fish in that area. If we have a particular look at brown trout in the different areas, we can see that in the beaver pool, we get fairly large brown trout. We're looking at the fort length of the trout here. And then at the old dam site, that sort of area where a beaver dam is broken down and you get a new pebble section, lots of smaller brown trout found at that location, which Southampton have, people involved in aquatic ecology, again, very excited about those findings. Observations from the River Tail also suggest that on this particular stream, sea trout are moving up and over beaver dams. Numerous landowners send me reports of sea trout moving over beaver dams. Some of these beaver dams are small, some of these beaver dams are remarkably large. We've got a photo here of a sea trout migrating over a beaver dam that's probably around 1.2 meters high. Again, a plunge pool is being created underneath this area of high flow, which enables the migratory fish species to get speed and power and to leap up over the top of the beaver dam. This year, in December, the beaver dam at this particular location didn't break down at all. And a lady that lives upstream of this site was inside her house in the evening with her sons, who are older sons, who fish. And they heard a noise outside and went outside to see what the noise was. They actually thought it would be a beaver, but believe it or not, they'd heard a sea trout creating a sea trout red. So that's a kind of almost like a nest where the sea trout lays its eggs in the stream outside their house. And sea trout are moving up and over these big structures. There's still work that needs to be done on this, and anglers are very concerned in some areas about that impact. And that's shown in this recent beaver article that came out last Saturday. So shoot beavers if they spoil our fishing. So there's clearly some people with concerns, and we need to work with these communities to make sure that we get answers, that we maintain communication. When beaver dams put water onto a floodplain, they can very quickly begin to dam the puddle that is formed and turn fields into this kind of setup where you have a large pond created. And at this particular site, this large pond is being created on an agricultural field. And that brings us to an area of conflict that we see in the River Otter and all across Europe and North America, where you have beavers and agriculture and farm ditches, you have conflict, and it's something that you have to manage. If you reintroduce beavers, you must have a resource available for managing the impacts of beavers. It's an extremely important message that we say time and time and again, and I'm not going to stop saying it now. So at this particular site, I did an evening walk over. It's an amazing site. Beavers have created a new wetland. You can count snipe, teal, mallards, little egrets. Actually found a teal that had been predated, so perhaps a peregrine falcon, using this as a hunting ground. All very exciting, but we had to remove it. This is an agricultural field. It's a dairy farm. The farmer does not want a pond at this location. His dairy unit is just in the background there. So you have to be very pragmatic when you're looking at beavers. I'm extremely passionate about conservation and ecology, and it's perhaps the worst part of my job to remove these kind of habitats, but it's a necessary part of the job if we have beavers back in England. This brings us on to agri-environment schemes and how we fund landowners for land management. We have come out of Europe. It feels strange saying that, because in my previous talks I've always said we are going to come out of Europe, but we have come out of Europe now. We will be changing the way that we fund landowners for managing land. Previously, we had the Common Agricultural Policy that rewarded landowners for the hectareage of land they owned. Perhaps in the future, we'll move to a system where we pay landowners and farmers for ecosystem services and the benefits they provide to society. Clearly and necessarily, that's for the production of food. And it should be really important, the production of food. I completely respect that. And I have lots of heated discussions with farmers about these topics. So food is very, very important, but landscapes also need to provide us with safety from floods. They need to provide us with clean water. They need to provide us space for biodiversity. Landscapes will need to capture carbon. They'll need to be more resilient to future climate change. So we've got a lot to think about at the moment. We're now going to go on to look at how beavers have impacted on a particular location. This is a case study of beaver activity impacting on farming and having a benefit to society. So it's a cost to the farmer, it's a benefit to society. So at this particular location, 6 beaver dams had raised the water table and had caused localized flooding in an agricultural field. This is an organic farmer. So the organic farmer spends 4 years using legumes to put nutrients into the soil and using cutting that for silage for dairy food or for food for his dairy stock. And in the 5th year, plants organic early crop potatoes as a cash crop, and that potato crop can use the nutrients put in by the legumes. However, this year he couldn't plant potatoes in the headland of this field, this bottom area, because of the waterlogging. That cost the farmer £2,000. Significant amount of money. The farmer has had a cost. However, Exeter University demonstrated that those same beaver dams that were causing that localized flooding were benefiting the society downstream. So the village of East Budleigh has had 5 flood events in the last 20 years, and the beaver dams were reducing the peak flow after significant rainfall events. That means there's less chance of flooding. They have created a more flood resilient landscape. It's not to say that this village won't flood in the future, but beavers are helping to reduce risk of flooding here. And they do this by slowing the flow of water and spreading the water out onto the floodplain. A really important point of our final report, and it was in the executive summary. So for those politicians that would have had little time to read the whole document, it's those who benefit from beaver reintroduction may not always be the same people that bear the costs. And again, an extremely important point. I had an outrageously heated discussion with a farmer this morning. It's quite a hard discussion to go through. So it's really important that we take people's concerns seriously and we act to manage situations if problems occur. The farmer at this particular location is a tenant farmer. The landowners own a lot of land, and the landowners and the farmer are happy with the current level of activity at that site. If we need to step in to manage beaver dams, we will do. In the enclosed beaver site, we have 13 beaver ponds. This is the site in West Devon, the little dot we saw on the map at the very beginning. Those 13 ponds now store over 1 million litres of water. That's around 230,000 gallons of water for those older folks listening in the talk today. And at this particular site, we've got a nice example of how the beavers slow the flow. So we've got a map here, and the map includes the dams and the beaver canals that the beavers have built over 6 or 7 years. We've got a measuring device measuring flow coming into the site and a measuring device measuring flow coming out of the site. And you can see that water coming into the site in this blue line, after heavy rainfall events, which is the dashes coming down, the flow into the site responds very quickly, and you have a rush of water running off the farmed landscape into this beaver territory. The water leaving the site, interestingly, before the rainfall, there's more water leaving than coming in. So this is acting as a sponge, gently releasing the water down the catchment without rainfall. But after rainfall, we can see that there's significantly less of a dramatic increase. So again, the beavers have slowed the flow at this site, and that's creating a more flood resilient landscape. And Professor Richard Brazier and his team are finding that the beavers are doing this time and time again in headwater streams across the country. When beavers slow the flow of water, it means that sediment and agricultural pollutants can drop out of the suspension in the water. So we see the water coming into the site is chocolate sauce, and we see the water leaving the site is clean and clear. And for those of us interested in aquatic ecology, in invertebrate life in streams and rivers, the beavers can obviously have a role to play in creating cleaner water. Again, there are many issues to do with clean water. Beavers could help to provide solutions. They are not the only answer. Another important tool that Exeter University have created is a dam capacity model. So that is the capacity for any stretch of watercourse to take beaver dams. So how many beaver dams does Exeter University think could be created in a particular area? When we have a dam capacity model, we can add conflict onto that model, which can give a beaver manager, such as myself. I never thought I'd end up being a beaver manager, but it turns out that that's happened. So we have a dam conflict model, and we can have areas where we know we might have to work harder to manage dams if they occur in that particular location. That could potentially be because they impact on property, on infrastructure, on important other conservation issues, perhaps a triple SI. You know, it's a useful model to have, and we're able to put a number of different conflicts into that model. Landowners with machinery do manage beaver dams in the River Otter catchment. This is something that is commonplace across Europe. This is Clinton Devon Estates managing a beaver dam. Very simple if you've got a tractor and a grab. It's a little bit harder if you're using a pickaxe. Devon Wildlife Trust had, I should say, a few volunteers that we were using before COVID lockdown, and we hope to get that going again after we've all been vaccinated. One of the other methods we use to manage the height of beaver dams is by installing flow devices. Flow devices are pipes that go through a beaver dam or one side of a beaver dam, and they allow us to take water from behind a beaver dam and release it downstream without the beavers realizing what's going on. It is stupid to work out what's happening. They are highly evolved, but it appears they're not particularly intelligent. So we have to protect the inflow so that the beavers don't block it. Personally, I don't like using flow devices. I feel it changes the nature of a beaver dam, and water flows through the pipe rather than flowing over the top of the beaver dam. And yeah, it's got its place, but I'd rather use other management techniques if I can do that. At this particular site, we installed the flow device. It's worked really well. The farmer was happy with the level of water after we'd installed the flow device, and in fact asked us to raise the water level slightly, which we did. And at that particular location, we have intensive agriculture and a beaver family coexisting. As I've said, beavers feed on trees. All of the trees in Europe have evolved with large herbivores. This means that trees that are browsed on or grazed on by herbivores tend to be able to re-sprout and regrow. At least once a fortnight or once a month, we get an email from members of the public concerned because they've been Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego, that's South America, where beavers were where beavers were introduced, North American beavers, and there are non-native species in South America. They're a problem species. The trees in South America there have not evolved with beavers and other large herbivores, therefore they do not survive beaver feeding. However, trees in Europe, willow, poplar, aspen, birch, hazel, oak, ash, well, ash isn't going to happen too much in the future, trees coppice, and they can coppice because they've evolved with herbivores. So people refer to this as damage. I tend to refer to it as beaver feeding. The trees that they impact at the moment in the otter catchment, they go for willow. So they do seem to have a preference for willow, although saying that, we've seen them feed on a range of tree species, including fruit trees, which can frustrate property owners significantly. We don't see them moving far from water to feed on trees. They typically feed on trees that are overhanging watercourses or are a few meters from the watercourse. The furthest I've seen a beaver move from water is 60 meters, and that's to access maize. So maize is a nutritious crop. Badgers like eating maize, deer like eating maize, we like eating maize, cows like eating maize, and beavers also like feeding on maize. We'll go on now to a little bit of, I'm aware the time's moving on, I'll go a bit quicker over the next few sections. We've been monitoring some sites very closely. Again, ex-university research, they use a drone and they fly the drone over a particular location. And as the drone flies over a site, it takes endless images. Ex-university then stitch those images together to make a 3D model of a site, such as this. And they do this 3 or 4 times a year. And then we can look at the impact that the beavers are having on canopy structure. And at this particular location, which is a county wildlife site, we can see the areas in red are areas where beavers have reduced canopy structure. At this particular location, that's really exciting. This is a county wildlife site, mainly for the botanical interest. And removing the canopy structure at this site allows more light in, which is very beneficial. Also, if you remove canopy structure and you have new wetlands being created, that means you have light coming down into the water, which enables aquatic plants to grow, so plants that grow in water. When you have plants growing in water, you get invertebrate life. When you get invertebrate life, that's the base of the food chain, and that's what's going to benefit our birds and bats and all sorts of other species. We do have conflict with feeding on trees. Very little, considering how many beavers we have, but we've worked hard on this. We can protect trees using a sandy paint mix, or we can protect trees using fencing material, so wire fence. I prefer the sandy paint mix. It looks better, it's cheaper, it's easier, and it works really well. I've already mentioned fruit trees. This is a Bramley apple tree, the only Bramley apple tree that this particular lady had in her garden, and the beavers have annihilated it. So as you can see, we've all got to learn to live with beavers, and that does mean fencing orchards if they're close to watercourses. As I've said, beavers feed on agricultural crops, and we've been working hard with landowners to learn how to manage these situations. If you have a maize crop close to a stream, beavers will start feeding on it. Feeding impact isn't that great, but what is a larger impact is the fact that beavers will tend to dam that stream if they can, so that they can build a lodge close to their food source. That can mean that you have a lodge beneath the maize field. If you have a lodge underneath a forage harvester, that's a huge piece of machinery. That could potentially damage the machinery. It could potentially hurt the driver of the machinery, and obviously it could squash some beavers. This again brings us back to agri-environment schemes and the way we manage landscapes. And I'm sure there's lots of people listening to this talk that would like to see agricultural crops pushed further away from watercourses so that we buffer these areas from agricultural pollutants. A really important part of the River Otter Beaver Trial was the creation of a slightly less exciting looking document than the Science and Evidence report, but it's a really important document. And that is how we manage beavers in the future. And that's looking at the hierarchy of management and how we can get organisations around the table to create beaver management groups so that we have people's concerns within a catchment and we can respond to those concerns. And it's a sensible way of managing beavers within each catchment. It also outlines the hierarchy of management. So my steps, if I have a phone call from a farmer saying they've got problems, how I act as a beaver manager to work around certain issues. So future decisions. Well, this spring, I believe that the English government will be consulting on the future of beavers in England. They need to look at whether the beaver will become a protected species or not. There are pros and cons of creating protected species. Will resources be made available for the management of beavers? Clearly, they can provide ecosystem services. How much is that rewarded? So yeah, lots to talk about. The River Otter Beaver Trial received no funding from government. It was funded entirely by Devon Wildlife Trust and the following organisations. So thank you very much to those organisations, and thank you very much for listening. That's about 45 minutes. I'm sure there'll be a few questions and I'll do my best to answer them. And I will stop sharing the screen.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Jake. Well, yeah, it's all very interesting, some great footage there as well. Yeah, we've had a few questions come in on the chat, especially towards the end there, but I think we'll go back to some of the early ones. So a really important one was about if beavers naturally migrate to new catchments, who is responsible for their management?
Okay, so it's a good question. At the moment, we don't know. So the government will be consulting, as I've said, this spring, and this is what we need to iron out. Who is financially responsible for the management of beavers? If they're a protected species, that means they might need more management. At the moment, we have a number of organisations within the county, within Devon, that are interested in managing beavers. Devon Wildlife Trust obviously have a level of expertise in managing the impacts of beavers and working with X-University to monitor beaver activity. We've also got the Beaver Trust, which is another charity that established almost purely to focus on providing more space for nature. And that's a recent addition to sort of conservation charities. And in the very near future, I think we'll begin to see beaver management groups established because there are beavers living in other catchments in Devon already. Those are currently unlicensed wild populations. So again, this government consultation needs to look at those other wild populations that live within Devon, within Kent, and lots of other counties across England, and decide how we're going to go forward, how this is going to be funded, what it's going to look like. So it's a big consultation, and I would encourage everybody that's passionate or keen and interested or has concerns about beavers to input into that consultation that I think I've heard potentially might be starting this spring.
Okay, thanks, Jake. That's really useful to hear. And you mentioned towards the end there, oh, sorry, there's a bit of an echo. I'm just going to mute you, Jake, while I'm talking. I think it's probably you. You mentioned towards the end about the slightly less glamorous but very important beaver management strategy. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that as well as part of that answer, just to. Oh no, sorry, I was trying to unmute you. There we go.
So yeah, I won't expand on that at the moment. We really need the government to get organised and to lead this consultation and to make some decisions. Yeah, at the end of the summer, if this consultation goes forward, we should be better placed to make sensible decisions about the future management of beavers across England.
Okay, thanks. I suppose it's worth saying that the management framework from the experience on the Otter does have, it's how you could do it, not who is responsible potentially is covered in that from your learning so far.
That's it. It provides a framework, perhaps a useful framework that could be rolled out as and when necessary. Some small catchments It might not be necessary to have an entire management group. We could have sub-catchments or entire catchments or regions working together in the future. We can look to Europe as to how they manage beavers. Some countries do it better than others. Perhaps a really good example of beaver management, we can see Germany, unsurprisingly, highly organized Southern Germans managing beavers. They have beaver wardens, beaver managers effectively that are paid for, and they have 2 paid for beaver managers across Bavaria, which is a large state, you know, pretty big, even comparable to sort of 2/3 of England. And they have a network of beaver sort of volunteers that work with people on the ground to sort out problems. That's how they do it. Beavers are a protected species in Germany, but it's very simple to get round issues. So dams that support the species, so that if you have a beaver dam with a lodge behind it where beavers are having kits, that may be a protected, protected structure. So you can't remove that dam. You might be able to lower the height and maintain the height at a certain level. Other dams within that territory, because it's not supporting a beaver lodge, you just have to phone up your local volunteer, that could be a local mayor in Germany, and they give permission, and farmers crack on and manage the impact. So that's a really good example. Fingers crossed we get going and put something sensible in place.
Great. Okay, thanks, Jake. So yeah, thanks to Charles for that question. I'm conscious there's more questions coming in. There was a couple of other interesting ones from earlier there as well. One was about the Lower Otter restoration project. So the plans that have just got planning approval to flood the Lower Otter between Otterton and Budley, the historic estuary, and make that into its historic kind of mudflat state. Yeah, there was just a question about how is that going to be a problem for beavers?
No, I don't think so. We've got beavers living throughout the catchment, and yeah, the LORP, so the Lower Otter Restoration Project, got planning permission, is due to go ahead soon. So that's a work in progress, and Environment Agency are leading on that project. Yeah, so shouldn't be problems. Yeah, if beavers can use saltwater habitats, so they do get saltwater poisoning. If they stay in that habitat, a bit like otters that you might see on the west coast of Scotland, they can cope with saltwater. They'd have to come out into freshwater to clean and to drink. But we might find in the future that if we do have sort of intertidal zones like that, we might see beavers dispersing out to sea to get around to catchments that way. Or we might see the young 2-year-olds that are desperate to establish a territory trying to survive in that kind of habitat, which would be pretty tough for them. But yeah, if there's a food resource, we would have beavers.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paul, for that question. And I'll come on to the other newer questions in a moment. But another one that came up, it actually came up before we started talking about impacts on trees and tree protection measures that you've taken in the Otter. But there was a question about, so it said Scottish and Canadian beavers kill around 100 adult trees a year. 150 family groups will potentially wipe out most of the trees in the Otter Valley. How can this be managed?
Okay.
So, yeah.
So I've talked about sort of the fact that tree species have evolved with large herbivores, and that's a range of large herbivores over millions of years. So the reason why we can coppice hazel is probably because large herbivores have been doing it for an awfully long time, but they don't kill trees. They do potentially, if it's a very old tree or a weak tree and they were to fell that, that might be the sort of straw that broke the camel's back, but certainly for species like willow, hazel, and I've even seen sort of oak trees up to 25 centimetres, 30 centimetres felled by beavers, and they're regrowing. So trees coppice and survive, and in fact trees that are coppiced tend to live longer. Coppicing regenerates root growth, stimulates root growth and stimulates above ground growth. Now beavers are extremely territorial. If another beaver strays into other beaver's territory, there's a risk of death. And actually I put a slide up earlier in the talk, and I didn't mention it at the time, but there was a bite mark in that beaver tail, and that's from beaver on beaver conflict. So you have a hotspot of beaver activity at the center of the beaver territory. And some of you have seen this, and I know that some of you are concerned about tree felling in the center of these beaver territories. But that's a very small area compared to the overall length of the River Otter and the amount of trees that we find And I do a winter survey every year, nearly all of the main channel of the River Otter, quite a bit of the tributaries. I cover as much ground as possible, which is a fantastic part of the job, actually. I'm extremely privileged to do that work. And I do see hotspots of activity, but they are extremely tiny when considered in the total length of the river. The other thing to consider is that biodiversity likes different habitats. And quite often in the river, you'll find that the age class and the structure of trees along a certain stretch are the same. That's not particularly exciting for biodiversity. So if you coppice trees by the riverbank, you actually create more diverse habitats. Now, as well as beavers coppicing riverside trees, landowners coppice riverside trees. Clinton Devon Estates coppice lots of the lower otter regularly, and that's to try and stabilize the bank. I've said that this coppicing action stimulates root growth. That's the reason why Clinton Devon Estates are doing it. And it's actually hilarious that in some points of the River Otter, you can see almost the beavers mimicking the Clinton Devon Estate behavior of managing bankside trees. I can understand that we've got different users on the watercourse. Some people enjoy the watercourse just for a nice relaxing stroll, the sounds of it. Some people will particularly enjoy the trees. We have fishing communities where tree cover, trees in the water are very important for certain fish species that they're interested in fishing for. So there's a lot to consider, and I accept the question, but it's just not going to happen.
Okay, well, thanks. Hopefully that's answered your question, Adrian. Dominic, I think there's some more newer questions that I haven't spotted yet, so I'll hand over to you. We'll take it in turns.
Yeah, on the subject of fishing, actually, we've had a question from Alistair Rogers saying, please do not underestimate the problems beaver activity may cause to migratory fish. An independent review of the River Otter Beaver Trial by the Inland Fisheries Institute has highlighted significant issues, and migratory fish are already under huge pressure. Needs very careful thought before you accept beavers are a good idea in any catchment. I know that's a big issue.
So, hi Roger, nice to see you, and thanks for the question, and thanks for pointing us towards that review. Professor Richard Brazier will be responding with other academics with a scientific review back to that particular document. Roger, can you just remind me who funded that piece of research? So Alistair, can you remind me who funded that piece of research?
He's probably going to be muted at the moment unless I can find him.
Yeah, I'll mute him. You should have the option, Alistair, if you want to.
Hi, Alistair.
Yeah, hi. Well, it was funded by various bodies, Jake, as you know. Mainly the Angling Trust, but it was not done as a review on behalf of angling. It was done as a review on behalf of wild fish.
And Alistair, we agree on many points and I think we're interested in very many shared issues about the water quality of catchments. I think there have been lots of discussions around beaver dams and potential barriers. I don't personally think certainly that the dams I've seen on the River Tail, I know don't pose problems to the sea trout I've seen moving over them. Other migratory fish species, eels, obviously wouldn't struggle getting through a beaver dam. And I guess the important point to make with the fisheries and with communities concerned about beaver dams is the scale of stream that they can build a dam on. So the sheer power of our streams means that beaver dams do not survive on many of the streams within the River Otter catchment. If we look at the weirs and the other structures that impede fish migration, they are very significant, and that's what the recent news this week was about. And in fact, the first fish sea trout that we saw spawning on the River Tail for many years was after we discovered that a fish ladder was actually totally blocked at one of the weirs. So I think the threats to migratory fish species are human-made structures, and I think those are the structures that we should be focusing on.
Well, I don't know if you want to debate about that at the moment, but there are issues, Jake, I think you would accept on this, and some of these issues need to be considered very carefully by the Culm because it will impact on their fish populations. So I would just recommend that people actually take a serious look at the whole issue before getting too excited about all the social, all the other benefits, and look at the costs in that respect.
So as far as I'm concerned, Alistair, I think all science should be based on a precautionary approach where we do act carefully. I'm very aware that the populations of sea trout and salmon are in absolutely shocking states. And I can understand concerns that beavers might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. I don't think that's going to be the case, but I completely understand that things need to be taken seriously, and we are taking them seriously.
I'll hold off there. Thank you very much for letting me speak.
Thank you, Alistair.
Well, we have lots of questions, but we're almost spoiled for choice, aren't we, Stephen? Where should we go next?
Yes. So someone called. Sorry, someone just physically raised their hand on the video. You're called Christine's iPad. I don't know if you want to say something. Do you want me to unmute you? We'll come back to the questions in the chat in a sec. Okay, you should have the option to unmute yourself now if you want to ask something.
Thank you very much. My name is David Batley. I'm a tourist in your wonderful part of the world. I live in Hertfordshire and intend to move to Norfolk, which will be the River Ant and the River Bure catchment, ideal beaver territory. I'm writing a book for the curious tourist, having stayed at Nightstone Farm with Vicky and David Lawrence last September. Mm-hmm. For what it's worth, I used to teach agriculture, and I then left agriculture. I couldn't bear agriculture anymore, and taught adults with learning difficulties in the Lee Valley how to coppice hornbeam, which again would be one of your trees, Jake, that has been herbivored for the last umpteen million years. And they in the Lee Valley, the coppice is a 13-year cycle. Hornbeam is special; it burns without taint, and it was the fuel wood for the malting industry, which in turn fed small beer to London. Thank you very much for listening. Oh.
Okay, thanks for that. I think there was another question from Colin McLeod, which said an issue picked up in the Knapdale Beaver Trial, also apparent in parts of the Tay catchment, is that high levels of roe deer browsing sometimes impede what should be natural coppice recovery. So deer numbers plus beavers potentially causing an issue. Deer numbers may need to be better managed. Links anyone? There's a quick question from him, but yeah, maybe it's good. So this is it. This is how the reintroduced species interacts with other species. Really good ecology and fascinating. Where we are in the River Otter, we do have quite a few roe deer. What we're actually seeing at many of the beaver territories is that the beavers are coppicing willow and feeding on that willow, and they're then coming back to that same willow tree about 3 to 4 years later, when you've got almost the perfect size willow branch for a beaver, and they're recoppicing that same tree. Many animals do this. This is kind of like optimal foraging theory, where you have an organism spending as less energy as possible to feed. Where you have high levels of other species browsing, the fear is that the other species stop that growth from coming back up. As I've said already, beavers are very territorial, so the impact on tree species is within these beaver territories, and you have these significant gaps most of the time between beaver territories. There is a PhD looking into this in Scotland. I'm in contact with that particular PhD student. I'm really interested to see what she finds. And when we have results from that, that may well impact on the management of deer, as well as the management of beavers. Certainly, management of wildlife populations is something that it can be hard for organisations like Devon Wildlife Trust to talk about, because it does involve culling animals. And people
get very, very passionate about this, and sometimes quite rightly so. And you've got the spectrum for conservationists all the way from the animal rights sort of side of things all the way through to me. I guess I'm the other end of things. I'm a meat eater, and I understand that certain wildlife populations need to be managed, and there are good ways of doing that, and there are very bad ways of doing that. So up where I live, near Tiverton, we have the Tiverton staghounds that come out frequently and chase deer around the country completely illegally. Active dog, not acceptable. Somebody culling a deer in the best possible way, and that meat going into the food chain, that's a very good way of managing deer populations. So yes, managing wild populations is something that is necessary. We live in a human-dominated landscape.
Okay, thanks for that, Jake. Couple of other quick ones on sort of, I suppose, more kind of practical and local level. Interesting comment and question from Daniel Osmond, who said, it strikes me that much of the conflict is in hypotheticals of what the beavers may or may not be doing to fish, trees, etc. I've been blown away by the positives of biodiversity and aquatic restoration, having visited a few of these sites. Would the Wildlife Trust consider post-vaccines doing guided walks to showcase the habitat changes?
Potentially. Some of these sites are very sensitive. You have landowners that might not want people on the land. You have very wet areas that really can't cope with traffic. We tend to signpost people to certain areas within the catchment, and those can be found on our website. But even that causes conflict. And I'm very aware that we're talking about this, and that, as I said before, we have different users of the river habitats. And if you get lots of people looking at beavers and they start shouting at fishermen, and those fishermen have paid good money to fish in those areas, we need to be terribly respectful of the different users of these river habitats. So yeah, that's something that we steer clear of a little bit. It might be something that we do in the distant future, when we get a landowner that's extremely willing to do this, or is extremely keen to do this, and we have a site that is well set up with infrastructure. At the moment, we don't have that, so that's not going to happen in the near future.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Jake. Yeah, and on a similar point, Ivan asked other plans to encourage greater access, knowledge, or location of beavers for the general public. So I suppose you've kind of already answered that by saying there are, and if you can read a map in the report, there are maps that show you locations if you know the area of where you've seen feeding signs. So is a better approach maybe for people to, local people, especially post-COVID, to be able to just go and explore and look out for signs of beaver activity.
Yeah, I mean, stick to public footpaths, behave yourself, respect the countryside, yeah. All those sensible things.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point. I had a separate quick question actually, which was about the Culm Garden Village, which you mentioned briefly, and maybe after this, Dominic, if there's any others from the chat, we can come back to those. You mentioned a kind of what a resilient development for or resilient to beavers would look like, or kind of that's an aspiration. But yeah, I wondered if you wanted to expand on that a bit about what that might look like.
Yeah, I mean, it can be very simple. So you provide space around watercourses. If you do have any embankments that have water or have streams higher than areas that you're going to build on, you need to make sure that those are securely built in the first place, so that beavers can't build lodges in those locations. If you're thinking about putting footbridges or roads across small streams, then don't build culverts, have open span bridges. They're more expensive, unfortunately, but it means that beavers won't block the culverts and start to build dams around the culverts. Beavers can be very canny and can fill culverts up with wood. It's not necessarily that they block the entrance, it's they fill them up on the inside with wood. It's quite hard to get the wood out. So if you're starting afresh, there are some really easy things that you can do to build in resilience. I think the best thing is to keep have that green space and have that, I don't know if it's called blue space actually, but have that water space and provides significant space for nature to happen around that. It could make the garden village extremely pleasant in the future, a very biodiverse place, and a very nice place to go and walk around. So that's what I do. If you need to put infrastructure, put it in early. Make sure that it's not going to get damaged by beavers. Make sure that beavers aren't going to tunnel through areas that you don't want them tunneling through, and just to give nature space. It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jake. There's a question in from Sean Leonard at Wild Trout Trust. Hello, Sean. It's good to see you here. He's commenting really about the fact that, and it's a general question maybe we should sort of explore, is how beavers evolved alongside salmon and trout. But we're now in this hugely crowded country of 55 million people. How can we make space for each other? You know, it's a very crowded landscape we live in, isn't it?
It is. So the government have set a target, the 30 by 30. So that's all about providing space for nature. National parks like Exmoor National Park have rewilding now in their sort of future strategy, I guess. And on the Exmoor National Park one, there was even, I think, mention of beaver, which is at the top of the catchment. So in some areas, we can imagine landowners getting paid through Agri-Environment Schemes to provide space for nature. That's going to have to happen because our entire landscape is dominated by human management. As an ecologist, it's actually, the more you learn about ecology, sometimes the more depressing it gets to wander around the countryside, because you begin to realize that, as you say, everything is managed by humans. So if you go to the Lake District, you realize that that looks like a depleted landscape. There are no trees. If you go to Europe and you have hills, you have lots of forests, clean water coming down. But the Lake District is this, you know, it looks all right. It's nice to go for a walk, but it's a denuded landscape. It's not particularly great for biodiversity. So yeah, we need to change the way we look at landscapes if we're going to provide space for nature. And that's going to be a big change for lots of farmers. It's going to be a big change for society, and society will have to pay for it. If we want space for nature, we're going to have to pay for it, because farmers will not, and do not, rightly so, they need to have a good income. So if we're going to pay landowners to do this, we need to make sure that we get behind them to provide space. If we look at other countries' national parks, they're less of a museum. So some of our national parks are almost frozen in time, with a certain history of land management paused, and that's what we want that national park to look like. It's not necessarily for biodiversity or for capturing carbon. Maybe in the future we might have more important things to think about other than just how it looks or a nice place to go for a walk, that kind of thing. So yeah, providing space for nature in a country that's one of the most densely populated in Europe is going to be tough, because we have lots of infrastructure that stretches back for centuries, that is so close to nature, so close to water, the old water mills that dot every single stream in England. So it will be challenging in some places, but I think the thing is we need to jump on the easy opportunities to start with. There are some farmers extremely keen to pursue more natural methods of farming, lesser stocking rates, which can be good for nature. Some farmers interested in perhaps looking for income through rewilding, and perhaps some big organizations that could do significant things. So if you look at the combined land ownership of the Ministry of Defence, they own a significant percentage of land in England. Maybe we could do better things with that landscape. We still obviously need to train armies and to make sure people are prepared, but perhaps that should be right at the forefront of rewilding. And perhaps the National Trust should be the same. All of these organisations that have been doing various things. So I think there are significant opportunities. I just think we need to go for the easy ones first and see where that leads us.
Thanks for that, Jake. And something else for people to keep an eye out for as well this year might be the Nature Recovery Network and the local nature recovery strategies, which will be coming out in the next year or so, which, yeah, exactly, we'll aim to do some of what you talked about there, Jake, about kind of connecting up.
Stephen, should we have one more question and then wrap it up?
Yeah, sure. So Richard Brunning, if I'm pronouncing that right, you've mentioned a few times of your experience of beavers in France. He just said something else as well. He was just asking, do beavers create bypass channels for their movement beside their dams? And also, I think this was maybe relating to a question that came further up as well when there was discussion about fish movement. He said all the beaver dams I saw in France had a bypass channel that the beavers used to travel and below the dam. these were ideal for fish movement. So I don't know if you want to comment on that at all,
Yeah,
Jake.
so the key thing to say there is if the beaver dams are allowed to develop naturally. So if you've got space for the beaver dam to increase in size and typically move just onto the floodplain, small or large floodplain, then the stream naturally will evolve at the side of the beaver dam and cut round and through. And we've got a number of sites where we've now got fresh multiple stem channels with fresh gravels in that work round the sides of beaver dams. And yes, in high flows, you can imagine migratory fish species potentially moving through those areas.
Okay. All right, great. Thanks, Jake. Well, yeah, I think we'll have to draw a line under it there. The recording of this will be available, as will the chat, on the website in the next couple of days. I suppose just to wrap up, there's been lots of interesting discussion, and thanks again to Jake for a really interesting presentation and sticking around for questions and answers as well. I think just to say a couple of quick things. It seems like there's lots of benefits and costs as well involved in beavers being in our landscape and managing that. And I think one of the key things that came out of the River Otter Beaver Trial and that you've emphasised this evening, Jake, is that those costs and benefits are experienced by different people. So there needs to be a management strategy and there needs to be a brokerage system in that as well. And there's also, been concerns about trees and fish, and we've explored those a little. And I think in the future there'll be, maybe more science that needs to address those issues. Some of them feel kind of somewhat potentially hypothetical in the sense that we don't know fully how beavers are going to operate in different catchments. They've been monitored a lot in the Otter. And
I would just chip in here that we can look to North America and to Europe because they have lots and lots of beavers. And for instance, some of the best salmon runs in Norway are in catchments with beavers. Mm-hmm. But okay. That's in a wilderness area. So we can look to other areas, but it's not easy necessarily.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. Yeah. And also that those factors face other big challenges, the existing water quality and other barriers to fish passage, for example. So I think all of us will look out for the consultation in spring. Fingers crossed it appears, and we'll keep an eye out for that and what that means for the future as well of our catchment and the future of beaver as a wild species in this country. So it's very exciting. Thank you again to Jake, and thanks to everyone else as well for joining. Again, I'll just say keep an eye out on the website for other events that are coming up. I mentioned even actually next week the first the next meetings of the working groups. So if you want to get more involved and come along to have kind of smaller discussions with people on different things, then check out the dates for those all throughout March. Thanks again to Jake and everyone else, and we'll call it a day there.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jake.